6 hours into the standoff. The HOA guards were sunburned, my coffee was cold, and the sign duct-taped to my gate read in block letters, "No entry until you apologize to Prudence." One guard hammered the fence with the back of a clipboard like it was a gavel trying to pass judgment. The other one read from a script in a monotone voice that he'd probably repeated a dozen times already. "Sir, per Juniper Crest, Directive 14C. You must say I'm sorry for causing Miss Holbrook's breakdown," verbatim. I stood there watering my alias with the garden hose and asked them politely if they needed sunscreen. The younger one's face was already turning pink. They didn't find that funny at all. The older guard took a step forward and told me this could all be over if I just did the right thing. I asked him if the right thing included blocking a man's driveway for 6 hours. He didn't have an answer for that. "My name is Ethan Corbett. I do quiet database work for a hospital. The kind of job where you fix problems nobody knows existed until they're solved. I keep my porch light warm, my lawn mowed exactly 2½ in, and my opinions room temperature. My wife Mary calls me conflict avoidant, like it's some kind of superpower. And honestly, she's not wrong." We moved to Juniper Crest Preserve for the walking paths, the decent schools, and the brochure's promise of curated serenity, whatever that meant. The houses were nice, the neighbors seemed normal, and the HOA fees were reasonable. Then I met Prudence Holbrook. She's the HOA president with pearl earrings that probably cost more than my car payment, perfectly coiffed hair that doesn't move in the wind, and a smile that looks exactly like a parking ticket. She introduced herself on moving day by weighing my doormat on a luggage scale to verify heft conformity. Apparently, there's a minimum weight requirement to prevent doormats from blowing away and creating visual chaos. I thought she was joking at first. She wasn't. She wrote down the weight in a little leather notebook and told me I was 0.30 under compliance. I should have known right then we were in trouble, but I just bought a heavier doormat and figured that was the end of it. At first, it was just notes. Little printed cards slipped under my door with rules I'd never heard of and couldn't find in the actual HOA documents. "Your wind chimes are in a minor key and invite melancholy. Please replace with C major by end of week." Then came the fines. My herb garden was apparently non-compliant because the basil was growing in what she called a chaotic pattern instead of neat rows. I didn't even know basil could be chaotic, but according to Prudence, it suggested an undisciplined mindset. The fine was $50 when I planted tomatoes. She sent me a citation because red vegetables were too stimulating for a serene community. She wanted me to grow only green or white produce. She started staging what she called wellness checks at 5 o'clock in the morning, rapping on my door with a wooden dowel rod and asking if my mental state was suitable for community living. She'd stand there in a pristine pantsuit with a clipboard, asking me to rate my stress levels and whether I'd been having aggressive thoughts. My neighbor 2 doors down told me she'd been doing this to anyone who questioned her authority. But the real incident happened on the 4th of July. We were in our backyard with some sparklers, just Mary and me having a quiet evening watching the fireflies come out. Nothing loud, nothing crazy, just 2 people enjoying their own property. Prudence marched through our side gate without knocking or announcing herself and stood there with her hands on her hips. she announced in this shrill voice that she was confiscating our sparklers. Immediately, because they were combustible vibes that threatened the neighborhood's energy balance. Mary looked at me like she couldn't believe this was happening. I asked Prudence, politely but firmly, to leave our property. I didn't yell, didn't curse, just asked her to go. That's when she performed a swoon worthy of community theater. Clutching our mailbox with both hands and breathing heavily like she'd just run a marathon. She pressed the back of her hand to her forehead and said I'd verbally assaulted her with my tone. 2 neighbors saw the whole thing from their yards. They both told me later it was the most dramatic performance they'd ever seen outside of a high school play. But that didn't matter. That night, the neighborhood forum exploded with her post. It was 3 paragraphs long, with words like traumatized and unsafe and hostile environment. The key line read, certain homeowners' weaponized tone. I'm recovering from a breakdown caused by verbal aggression. Within 24 hours, the board held an emergency session and voted to hire security. They called them compliance rangers, which sounds like something from a kid's cartoon. Their real job was to babysit me and make sure I stayed in line. Tuesday morning, I woke up at 6:30 to find them already parked across my driveway like a Tumen dam. They wore khaki vests with CR patches that looked suspiciously like stitched on mouse pads. Both of them had cheap walkie-talkies clipped to their belts and sunglasses that screamed security guard surplus store. One of them held up his hand as I approached my car with my work bag. Sir, we're here to facilitate community healing. You're not leaving until you provide a recorded apology to President Holbrook. I told them I needed to get to work. They said work could wait. Community came first. I told them to move their vehicle. They refused. They blocked my landscaper when he showed up at 8 to mow the lawn, telling him the property was under wellness supervision. They intercepted 2 package deliveries, opening the boxes to inspect the contents and logging everything in a spiral notebook. When the mail carrier arrived, they actually told her that the HOA now oversaw this called the Sachs temperament and all mail needed to be She told them that was a federal offense and delivered my mail anyway, but she looked pretty shaken up about it. When I called 911 from inside my house, the ranger somehow knew about it within minutes. One of them shouted through my window that this was a civil matter and not police business. Then the older one pulled out a laminated card and waved it at me through the glass with a smug look on his sunburned face. It said detainment authorization in bold letters at the top. It was signed by Prudence herself in flowing script and had clip art scales of justice in the corner, like she'd made it in Microsoft Word during her lunch break. Below her signature, it said, "Bearer is authorized to detain subject until reconciliation achieved." My doorbell camera was running the whole time. It captured everything, including their radio chatter, when they thought nobody was listening. One of them said into his walkie-talkie, "Hold until he breaks." The president wants contrition on camera. She wants tears, if possible. I saved all of that footage to 3 different cloud services. I also called my neighbor Dave, who's a lawyer for the hospital where I work. He owed me a favor for fixing his Wi-Fi router last month when he was ready to throw it off his balcony. Dave came over within an hour with his briefcase and his reading glasses and watched the footage twice. Then he made a phone call that I couldn't quite hear. 20 minutes later, 2 police cruisers showed up. Turns out detaining a neighbor over hurt feelings is not actually legal and doing it for money without a license is really not legal. When the police finally arrived, they didn't look amused. They watched my doorbell footage twice, rewinding to catch the part about making me break. Then they radioed the city licensing unit and asked them to run the security company's credentials. Big surprise, the security company's license had expired back in April, and nobody had renewed it. They'd been operating illegally for 5 months. The CR patches on their vests violated a state rule about wearing insignia that looks too much like law enforcement. You can't just make up badges and pretend you have authority. Dave arrived with a printed copy of the CC and RS, which are the actual community rules that everyone agreed to when they bought their houses. He highlighted the section that said the HOA has no authority to impede ingress or egress. That's legal talk, for they can't block your driveway or stop you from leaving your own property. The officers cited both guards for obstruction and something they called impersonation light, which apparently is when you pretend to have authority you don't actually have. A detective in plain clothes even collected their laminated detainment authorization like it was contraband stationery, sliding it into an evidence bag with a pair of tweezers. One of the guards tried to argue that Prudence had authorized everything. The detective told him that Prudence Holbrook wasn't the government and couldn't authorize squat. The emergency board meeting happened 3 days later in the clubhouse on a Thursday night. Every homeowner in Juniper Crest showed up. People were standing against the walls because there weren't enough chairs. The energy in the room felt like a powder keg waiting for a match. The projector screen displayed the body camera footage from the police. You could hear one of the rangers reading Prudence's text message out loud without realizing the cops were recording. No apology, no driveway. Keep him there all day if you have to. Then they played my doorbell audio where Prudence had left voice memos for the guards, coaching them on what to say. Make him feel the community pressure, her voice said with an icy determination. Make him understand that resistance has consequences. The room went dead silent. Prudence sat in the front row with her arms crossed, her face turning redder by the second. The city's licensing investigator stood at the podium and explained, in the tone of a patient mortician, the fines for operating unlicensed security services. He talked about liability and negligence and criminal exposure. He also detailed the penalties for attempting to detain a resident on private property without legal authority. Every violation carried a fine between $1,000 and $5,000, and there were multiple violations. Then the HOA insurance company representative joined by speakerphone. Her voice came through the clubhouse, speakers cold and professional, like she was reading from a script she'd read 100 times before. We're implementing an immediate coverage pause pending leadership changes. Until Ms. Halbrook is removed from her position, Juniper Crest Preserve has no liability insurance. Translation: they were cutting off the HOA's protection until Prudence was gone. If anyone got hurt or sued the HOA during this time, every homeowner would be personally liable. The room erupted. People started shouting questions. One man stood up and demanded to know how this had been allowed to happen. The board voted 6-1 to remove Prudence as president, effective immediately. The only vote against it was Prudence herself, who actually grabbed the gavel and banged it on the table, shouting that this vote was invalid and she was overruling it. The vice president had to physically take the gavel from her hand. When the treasurer asked for her keys to the clubhouse and the neighborhood gate codes, Prudence threw the keys across the table. They skidded off the edge and landed on the floor. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and shouted that this was a conspiracy. She said, "All of you are going to regret this," her voice shaking with rage. Then she grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the wreath fell off the wall. The consequences came down fast and heavy. Over the next week, Prudence had to attend a court-ordered workshop called Boundaries and Boards every Saturday for 3 months. A judge signed the order after reviewing the evidence. She was barred from contacting me except through a lawyer. The city fined her personally $12,000 for the unlicensed security operation and the attempted illegal detention. That came out of her pocket, not HOA funds, because she'd acted outside her authority. She also had to issue written apologies to everyone whose mail she had curated or whose deliveries she'd intercepted. That was 14 families total. The compliance rangers lost their contract immediately and had to surrender their mousepad patches. The security company shut down entirely after the licensing board launched a full investigation into their operations. Prudence stood in the parking lot after that meeting with her car keys in one hand and her phone in the other, staring at nothing while the other board members filed past her in silence. Her pearl earrings caught the light from the parking lot lamps. Someone later told me she just stood there for 20 minutes, not moving, like she couldn't process what had just happened. Her perfect little kingdom had collapsed in less than a week, and for the first time in years, Prudence Holbrook had absolutely no control over